Fleshgait by MP Real Invective. Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends. They're gone now. There is a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did, and it'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now, and I'm only left with the memories of them. I'm sorry for being over-sentimental and bringing everyone down, but I think this is the only way I can really introduce my story and explain why I feel like I have to type this out. I think that writing it down is the only way I can learn to accept it. I'll try to keep these downer tendencies to myself as I'm writing this down, but I can't make any promises. I know that being a third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse. Being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes you a semi-functional tricycle. But if you're the fifth wheel, you're left on some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or even cares about. Imagine not being able to follow in the in-jokes or shared history of one couple. Now, multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. It was that frame of mind that I had when we piled into Ian's car and went to the Gala National Forest for our hike. I know, it's a weird opening to give to all of this after my depressing opening, but I want all of you to have an idea of my kind of mindset. I'm not quite sure how to describe all of this, but I do know I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened to help me come to terms with all of it. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this would be to help you see it from my perspective, at least as much as possible. So, there we were, driving down to Gala for the hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel, wedged between 2 of Ian's friends who I didn't even know, 3 of us cramped in the back seat, while Ian and his girlfriend drove up front. I look back at the unnecessary bit of moping back in August 2016 as one of the last few moments of normalcy I would ever have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did. Ian was always the more social of us. Our mom used to tell us that Ian would make anyone his best friend, and that once I had a friend, I kept them. It was one of those paternal platitudes that was given to reassure the socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would take me almost 19 years to learn that that wasn't true. Instead of just taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, following a breakdown at an office get-together as a means for seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself away from the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working and told myself that I was doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that that wasn't healthy, and he convinced me to go on this weekend-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off work, that I saw he had invited others with him. I think he saw it as a way of getting me help and breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though Ian, with his extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I liked being in my shell. It was comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction where I got nobody's names, except for the ones I already knew, my brother and his girlfriend Jessica, due to my morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, we packed up in the car and left for our hike. It took almost 3 hours of awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the other's sleepiness, it killed it off fairly quickly. We found the parking lot near the Gala Cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we all took a moment to kind of bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town out of a cliff face, but 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty, except for just us, we would find out why later, and I was in need of some lubrication, We split a 6-pack of beer and took in the majesty. Here's a picture in case you are wondering what the area looked like. As we finished our beers and got everything prepared, we used the restrooms. Ian explained what path we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the west fork of the trail had been closed all summer due to the flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't even that dangerous. They just had opted not to clear it due to the recent flooding, so it would be a bit more of a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous in and of itself, it did keep us from encountering other hikers, which would cause us a lot of problems when we actually needed the help. Ian figured that we would make it about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and then we would be able to complete the Gala Loop, which was about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and ready for our respective jobs on Monday, and with no one any the wiser that we had just backpacked in a closed-off section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I don't even recall clearly, I'll opt to include a picture rather than spend a page writing about everything. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path that we were planning on taking. I'll include a more detailed map of the area below as well. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the entire area, so you can orient yourselves if you want to trace the trail that we took. If you plan on following along with the path that I tell you about, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost as I was then. I was just going along with the group, trying to stay positive and keep peace of mind about everything. I wanted to try and do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to set in. I had been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year, and I had no friends. I would go to work and then go home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend the whole weekend without saying an entire word to anyone, or even seeing another person. I knew that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm, and that frightened me. The first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time hiking and taking in the sights, soaking in the sun and breathing in the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upwards. I was unaccustomed to hiking, so I frequently fell behind, but I never completely lost sight of my brother or his friends. We took a break under the shade of a tree whose bark looked like dried scales from some sort of long-dead alligator. I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they'd been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only really managed to get the conversation going for a few sentences, but then it just shriveled up and died. I remember reassuring myself that it would just get easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before we continued our ascent up the Mesa. This was where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was here. The path up the Mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting, and wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or sideways glances, but it was easier said than done. They all seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this kind of stuff for years. By the time our path started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until we reached the top and I looked out over everything and I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was or where I was going or what trail markers we had been using. I imagined that splitting off from the group and thromping through the poison ivy, bumbling into a rapey gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering in circles, waiting for exposure to take me. What if I managed to hike back to the parking lot? where was I going to go? Would I go back home to my empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, and feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of the Indian Creek. After having hiked a decent distance, Ian was confident that we would make it back on Sunday, and that the next few days were going to be less intensive. We ate some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag a little ways from camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of the campfire that we had built when the conversation shifted to our most awkward moments that anyone had experienced. Ian retold the story of when he first met Jessica at a club where he was way too drunk for his own good and ended up puking into her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called him an asshole for it. Each person shared a story about a bumbling kiss where their braces got hooked to each other, locking themselves out of the dorm room in their underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunk boyfriend who just puked into their favorite bag. Then the bottle came to me, and it was my turn to tell a story. I instantly knew what the most embarrassing story was when we started the conversation. I didn't tell him about the door, though. I instantly made up some story about ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview that I had probably ripped from a 90s sitcom. They all laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of shit. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experience, and here I was, too afraid to tell the truth. To tell them about the door. The conversation continued for a little bit afterwards, as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we all got up and went to bed pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom. Still a bit fuzzy from the whiskey, I thromped out into the woods to do my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me had I not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter back at camp. She told me that she had dropped hers and asked me to help her look for it. But I was way too out of it to be any good to anyone, so I told her that we would look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling something of protest as I stumbled back into my sleeping roll. It wasn't until the next morning when I realized how stupid I had been. Apparently, they had heard howling all through the surrounding woods all night. They thought that the sound could have possibly belonged to a Mexican gray wolf, but no one was sure. Ian knew that they inhabited the area, but they were pretty uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf going out to pee in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out to answer the call of nature. We packed up a little while after a light breakfast and continued our hike. The second day was better. The overbearing sun that I suffered previously was hidden behind heavy gray clouds. We crossed a number of rivers and followed the 157729 junction. We went along Little Bear Canyon as we headed towards the JT Corral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, and despite nursing a slight hangover, I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack and clunky boots that my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling it and adding iodine tablets, as the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and yowling wolves had added a little bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't much joking around or conversations that night. We talked a little bit, but it had mainly just been small talk while we ate and stared at the campfire. Ian and Jessica were the first to call it for the night. I stayed up with the others for a little bit, but we were mainly silent. The other two slowly went off after a bit. I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer, then get ready to go to bed for the night. Just as I had finished dousing the fire, I remembered Jerry coming up and asking me for the map. He told me that he wanted to plan the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit that wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around in his bag. He sounded angrier the longer that he searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the pack for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped everything. He was practically ready to tear his hair out, and it seemed like he had spent the entire morning looking for that one thing. Wanting to know what was up, I walked up to him and started talking. He said to me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." Where's Jerry? I gave it to him last night so we could map out a little detour trip so we could visit this spring. Why don't you ask him? He probably knows. It was then that Ian said something that just changed everything. Jerry? Who are you talking about? You mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was... No, I'm talking about Jerry. Tall guy, kinda lanky. You're joking, right? He looked confused for a few seconds, then made a questioning sound like a really old computer trying to process something a moment before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked and Ian shouted, "Who the fuck is Jerry?" Getting the attention of everyone in the area. He was some fucking guy asked for our stuff in the middle of the fucking woods in the middle of the night and you just gave it to him? You handed our stuff to some stranger you just fucking met in the woods? I tried explaining myself to tell him that I knew Jerry and that he did too, since I remember hiking with him the day before. But I couldn't quite find the words to convey that point. It was here that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on. Ian vented more vitriol. How fucking stupid are you, Evan? Some random guy named Jerry comes up and asks you in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night for our shit, and you just give it to him? Jesus fucking Christ, we needed that map to get around smoothly since the trails haven't been cleared. Ian shouted for like 15 more minutes while everyone became aware of the situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough so we could figure out our next move. While we weren't completely screwed as Ian had memorized a large portion of the trail markers, it was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back to our car. We packed up our stuff making sure the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I had seen him this furious was just before he got into a fight with Aaron and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week and Aaron got a black eye and a busted lip, but he never said anything about our mother again. Each time we came to a break in the path, we had to stand there for a minute while we figured out where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were all overgrown only served to make everything just a bit more difficult. I think that is how we made a wrong turn and ended up going down the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where it went wrong, since we didn't have the map at that time, but it's my best guess. Further and further away from home and safety. Towards midday, tensions reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to cheer everyone up by saying that all we had to do was follow the compass and we would get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as we walked. I think she had the right idea since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had downed a fifth of vodka and was now trying to walk a tightrope, while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. The realization twisted something deep down inside me and made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and started talking to Lucas. "What's going on with you, man?" Ian, who was still pissed off at me, took this opportunity to vent a bit. "Huh? What are you talking about now?" "Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. What's wrong with him?" "Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike even started about his condition." As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me as clear as day. I recall Ian pulling me to the side and telling me about his friend's diagnosis, and how this was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike, so we had to help him and move kind of slowly. I remember watching him scramble up the trail and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthdays given to us from hospital beds, and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night when she thought that we were all asleep. Guilt flooded over me and I stepped over to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled and looked at me the instant I took a step forward to him. He dropped into a hunched position on his hands and feet, almost like his skin was bristling at a possible threat, and I could see his broken and decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from that last Planet of the Apes movie. His shaky and unstable balance was replaced with a more natural and animalistic gait. He loped into the woods and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were his clothing, slouching off his body, but they were actually gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk. What in the fuck? As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch flipped and everyone was set into panic mode. We began to run along the trail as fast as we can, as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think it took a good 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs on, and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, I surveyed the area around us and came to a terrible realization. In our panic, we had run off the path and we were now even deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over and over. What the hell was that? Over and over and over. The short answer is that it was Lucas. The long answer of it is this. There was no Lucas. Not really. I'm sorry for interrupting the story in the middle like this, but I know this is the best time to try to explain everything. I know how confusing this all must seem with Jerry and Lucas. The truth is, I don't think I could have appropriately explained it to you without experiencing it from my eyes. I don't know what you call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memory, they wrap themselves up in a wall of your recollections, and even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put a finger on it. Your group of 4 can grow to 5, and you wouldn't be any the wiser. A part of you will stupidly admonish you forever wondering how many there actually were. You look at it, you recognize the face, you remember the events, you remember getting drunk at a bar together, you remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it's true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls into your head somehow and makes you see things in a way that benefits them. They can mold memories, but they can't quite mimic human movement. It walks on 4 claws, not 2. It growls, hisses, and snarls. It doesn't talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It was hunting us, trying to drive us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never really reached much of a conclusion as to what the thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of there as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. We didn't tell the others. I think he realized that panicking would only get us into more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope that it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sound of distant animals yowling and calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same noises that we heard the first night out in the woods. Whatever the thing was, it was following us and calling out to other things in the area. At that time, I couldn't think about one of them just barreling out of the underbrush and sinking its black, rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us and we had only actually encountered one of those creatures. As the day pressed on, we seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. But I couldn't help but shake this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned his wish of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned toward her, but knew what was coming the second she asked. "We only took one car down, right?" Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated. "Of course we did. Remember how cramped everyone was in that tiny-ass Prius, with all our camping gear smashed in the trunk and on our laps? What about it?" Jessica went white as if this were the first time Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking, "How many of us are here right now, and how many does your car seat?" Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably, and there were 6 of us in the woods at that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore, Oliver's girlfriend gave a half-shriek, half-gasp while looking wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong there. Sarah was the only person who managed to say something, and that was, "Tss, me, Sarah." She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't mean that it dropped open like she was astonished or something. I mean it popped open like it had dislocated off of her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sickly pink void of inflamed gums that was at least a foot wide. She looked at us with these dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised her twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place with a hollow sound of a squelch of meat and bone shifting, as if nothing was wrong that had just happened, before she tried to speak again. "It's me." Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards this failed facsimile of a human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing, "Get out of here!" She hopped back from the attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all fours. Her body shuddered as if an electrical jolt had just passed through her, as she slowly backed away from us while facing Jessica the entire time. She retreated deeper into the woods with a convulsing lope. It only took a moment for all of us to regain our composure before we continued walking, while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him, "Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like an epileptic at a rave. You ever see one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing, it moved like one of those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person can do that to her body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried about that thing hearing us, though that wasn't really the case. We made him stop talking only because it was scaring us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around the campfire listening to the sound of a high-pitched whining and yelping coming from, well, all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got somewhat close to falling asleep, the calls would start up and jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers and tried to figure out what they wanted with us, even though none of us knew the answer to that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke and we continued our hike. We spent all of Sunday hiking around trying to find a familiar sight, without any real sense of where we were going. Our only hope was to stumble across another hiker or find an area with a high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't offer a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we would find another hiker, due to the fact that the trail had been closed and wasn't cleared. Even if we did, what are the chances that we could even trust them? And how could we be certain that it wasn't just another one of those things? Midway through the day, Ian whispered to me, "Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us again." I casually looked over my shoulder and noticed that one of our group didn't have any gear. They trailed behind us, but they were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly but didn't show any of the jerking moments of the previous two. The thought that it was learning to mimic our movements really unsettled me. Without thinking, I shrugged off my backpack and approached the impostor. Before they even knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant my hands pressed into their shirt, I felt something slick and warm give way, like the outer layer falling off of a rotten mango. The shirt slid off their body onto my hands, and I quickly realized that it was their skin. The thing was actually naked, but gave the appearance of clothing by altering the color of its almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin that slid off of its body, and it hit the ground with a wet slap. The creature toppled backwards and began yelping. I can only really describe the sound like this. Imagine getting out of the bed in the middle of the night and going to take a piss, and as you're feeling your way through the darkness to get out of the room, you accidentally step on your dog's tail. Imagine that yelp of pain and the surprise that comes along with it. Now focus on that emotion, the one that you felt when you heard that noise, that sudden surprise and guilt. In reality, the sound it made was nothing like a hurt dog. It just reminded me so much of a wounded pet that I couldn't differentiate the sounds. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking us and tormenting us. They were likely hunting us, and I still felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to, so I did. The thing writhed around on the ground for a few seconds, making a pitiable noise. It reached back with its arms and pushed itself upright on its hands, and on the balls of its feet. Its joints all popped wetly, and its muscles and bones adjusted to fit its new position. It crab-crawled away while shrieking the entire time. Ian pursued it with his walking stick, hoping to catch up to it and cave its fucking head in. It wasn't until the thing disappeared from sight that I realized the shrieking wasn't just coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone and Jessica's scream possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided that, well, I had to do something. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. She was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered to her that it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out that there was something terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down and I told her that everything was okay, that it was going to be alright. I didn't believe it myself, but it was the only thing I could think of that might bring her some kind of comfort. Ian returned fuming that the monster had escaped, and I awkwardly broke off the hug. Ian didn't say anything, he just started walking. We continued following him, hoping that he would find the right way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. 6 hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like we had been going in circles all day and made absolutely no progress. For all we knew, that thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were new and leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things wanted from us. They wanted us deeper in the woods. They wanted to force us to exhaustion. They wanted us too weak to defend ourselves, so they could descend upon us and eat us. Oliver was right about that. If this thing was similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were like some sort of prion disorder that probably came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided against having a fire and drawing more of them to us, we ended up reaching a conclusion that we needed to sleep in shifts. I volunteered for the first shift because my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me of any desire to sleep. The others went off without so much as a word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour into my watch that I realized that I was too. Given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needs sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after the encounter with the creature. I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible that the others haven't. We talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought it was and what was going on, and how everyone was handling it. She was worried about Ian. She confessed that he was acting erratic and scaring her. She looked into my eyes and told me that she was glad I was here. And I felt something twist deep down inside me that I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on watch, the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that her and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and she was wondering if they were even going to work it out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together. He made her feel wonderful, but there was something that didn't feel right. Like there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life. And, well, I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it. I had to tell her about the door. She listened quietly as I told her everything. It was the event that precipitated my breakdown at work and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis. Everything had started off simply enough one Friday at work. I was in the lunchroom eating my sandwich, reading a book, per usual, while my coworkers talked about their plans for the weekend. One of them was having a housewarming party and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured that the invitation was only extended to people that he was talking to, until he asked me if I would be able to make it on Saturday. This was the first time that I had ever been invited to hang out after work. I chose to go. I spent all Saturday getting ready, planning what were the interesting topics to bring up in case there was a lull in the conversation, and a bottle of wine I was planning to give as a special housewarming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand and my spirits high. I convinced myself that I was going to be the life of the party, and that if maybe I played my cards right, I could finally find a friend at work that would help the time fly by, instead of just dragging on. It wasn't until I reached the house that false bravado began to crumble apart. I stopped in front of the neighbors' houses. Everywhere else already had a car parked there. It was then that I felt my heart beating a mile a minute, like I had just ran. I began heading up the driveway with the bottle of wine slick in my hands. My palms were all sweaty. It wasn't until I reached the front door that I realized something was terribly wrong. All that excitement that had been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else. Apprehension. All those topics that I had thought up seemed boring, and all the reassurances I gave myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for this at all. At this point, a small part of me whispered something that has stuck with me to this very day. That voice imitated that they really didn't want me to come. They had only given me an invitation as a courtesy, and didn't actually expect me to show up to their house. It said that if I knocked on that door, I would be making a fool out of myself. It told me that I wasn't comfortable in my own skin, and how I would even dare to imagine that they would enjoy my company. They wanted to celebrate this with their friends. They didn't want to listen to me fumble on about something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding that I knock on the door and make myself look like an idiot. That part of me was told I was better off alone, and I listened. I turned around without even knocking on the door. No one had come in or out, and the music was playing loudly, so I doubt they would have even heard me anyway. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing at me as I drove away, flustered and embarrassed. Maybe they had just gone back to their party and joked about the social retard who had seemingly freaked out and run away from the house. All the while, I cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told my story. She smiled sadly as I started to cry. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All that fear, foolishness, and the fatalistic failure smashed into me like waves on the shore. She whispered soothing words into my ear and waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was there, under the moonlight with her face inches away from mine, that I did the worst thing I had ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked her in the eyes. I saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her as she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me, telling her all the things I should have said when I first met her, when I first realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid if I let go, I would lose the perfect moment. She was warm. She smelled like wildflowers. She smelled like happiness. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was comfortable. I was content. I didn't know when I drifted off, but I do remember waking up, in the love-drunk excitement of the previous night. I didn't once think about the consequences of my actions or Ian. I only thought about Jessica, and I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. I convinced her to cheat on him, with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed that she had gone back to her sleeping role in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night. The words bled out of me once they started. I couldn't stop it. I don't know what happened, man. We were just talking one moment, and then the next... Jesus, I didn't mean for it to happen. You know I love you, man. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. It just happened, and now I can't take it back. Jessica's cry of surprise cut me off before I could go any further. Both me and Ian turned to the sound of her distress, and instantly knew what had happened. The backpacks with our compasses, food, and water had all been stolen. I knew it. Don't you see, goddammit? It knew that we could identify it without a backpack. It couldn't shape its skin to take the appearance of one, so it stole them away from us. Now the next time it wormed its way into our group, we wouldn't be any wiser. Jessica and I never talked that night. Jessica had never even left my brother's side. They had zipped their sleeping bags together. She didn't open up or come out to me about her worries, and I never actually kissed her. I poured my heart out to that thing wearing Jessica's skin, while it was in my arms. I confessed my truest feelings to an entity masquerading as a person. I felt sick. The others woke up pretty quickly after hearing Jessica screaming. We quickly searched the area, hoping to find some scrap of food or some indication where our stuff had been taken. We found nothing. It was long gone. We had no food, no water, no hope. We had no way of telling when one of those things was hijacking our heads and pretending to be part of the group, so it could distract us. With our compasses gone, we had no means of following a set direction, and hoping to pick the trail back up. In short, we were screwed with a capital S. Oliver demanded to know what I was doing last night. He wanted to know how I could be so careless as to fall asleep when I should have been watching over them and our gear. I lied and told him that someone had come in the middle of the night and relieved me from my shift. What I didn't mention was that someone was impersonating Jessica. I couldn't bear to look my brother and his girlfriend in the eyes at this point. Oliver started to yell, but stopped when he saw I was on the verge of tears. I don't know if it was mercy or disgust that caused him to stop. It doesn't matter either way. We gathered up the only things that they hadn't taken in the night, which was our sleeping rolls, and continued walking. The hike without water or the prospect of food was unbearable. We were already exhausted, and the realization that we were going to be soon starving and dehydrated only served to zap more energy. Within a few hours, my mouth felt gummy and dry. While we were still under a canopy of leaves, the temperature was in the high 80s or the low 90s. It didn't take long for dehydration to set in. I kept licking my lips in an attempt to keep them moist, but I could feel them beginning to crack as my saliva began to dry up. As we walked, Oliver picked up his pace and caught up with me. I looked over at him and knew without saying a word that another one of those things had joined our group. He whispered, "Don't look directly at it. Just keep it at the corner of your eyes. I think that's how it messes with your mind. It would explain why you remember that guy last night, but the rest of us can't." You saw him, but the rest of us didn't. Don't get close. Just keep it in the corner of your eyes. It's been trailing us for about a half an hour now. I think it just wants to watch and follow us." I pretended to crack my neck and got a look at the tag-along partner in my peripheral vision. It trailed behind us by about a dozen feet. In its resting state, its facial features appeared, staticky. I could make out eyes and a nose, but the rest of it was shifting and rippling like a bubbling plastic. At this point, we were all too tired to even bother with chasing it off. We just kept walking and hoped that it wouldn't try to join the group. It seemed content to keep its distance and keep us in its line of sight. It followed us for about 2 miles before it broke off towards the trees, with a weird shambling and awkward gait. We were too tired to even try to set up a shift system. We all just huddled together in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were safer when we were closer together. But every time one of us got comfortable enough to drift off, those things would start making noise. The noises started off as high-pitched yips, whose sound seemed to travel for, miles. As the night drew on, they grew more aggressive. I remember one time I was drifting off hearing the grating rasp of my name. Evan. The things weren't just following us. They were learning. They were perfecting their mimicry. This thought disturbed me more than the idea of them out there watching us in the dark. How long would it take for one of them to become more human than human? What would they do once they're capable of walking amongst people again? I drifted off to sleep with that thought beating around my head, like a man trapped inside a wall. We got up on Tuesday morning and left without saying a word. At this point, there was nothing left to say. Some of us had been awake all night without any food or water. The constant stress had us completely worn down. We had continued hiking in the same direction we had been going, in the false hope that it would just, lead us across someone. In the end, our hike looked more like a death march. My feet were covered in blisters that ruptured and plastered the soles of my feet to my socks. Every step felt like I was tearing the wounds open a bit more. In an attempt to take my mind off the discomfort, I focused on my brother who was walking in front of me. He wasn't as much walking as he was limping forward. He had stopped using his walking stick and was just kind of dragging it behind him like a broken limb. I watched as he stepped over a rock and the walking stick slipped out of his hands. He kept dragging himself forward as if nothing happened. He didn't even register it falling out of his hands. It was at that point that I knew something was wrong. I knew that my brother wasn't my brother anymore. I quietly picked up his stick as I passed it. Amy went to call out to him to ask if he was alright, but I shushed her. I was so sure that one of those things had replaced him and was now leading us deeper into the woods. I realized that I would only have one chance at this. The instant that it knew that we knew, it would try to run away. All it would take is one good swing to the back of its head, and we would be able to take one of those things out. The stick had a bit of weight to it, about 5 or 6 pounds. Enough to crack open a skull if it was swung hard enough. I began walking faster while trying to avoid the underbrush that might give away my approach. The thing wearing my brother's skin continued to limp forward as I drew closer. I waited until I was within swinging distance before raising the stick above my head. My heart was beating in my chest and my palms were so sweaty that I thought the stick would slide right out of my hands. It kept moving forward, completely unaware of what I was about to do. I whispered, "I'm sorry," just before I swung the stick down with all my strength. Ian turned to face me as he mumbled groggily, "Sorry for what?" My muscles locked and I stopped mid-swing, and the stick stopped inches from his face. He blinked in surprise before muttering, "Evan, what's wrong?" His voice sounded distant and empty, like he was in a between waking and sleeping state. It was then that I knew the extent of his condition. He was pale and looked like the slightest breeze would blow him over. He wasn't one of those things. He was delirious from dehydration, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The walking stick fell out of my hands and bounced on the ground next to us. I dragged my tongue across my lips. It felt like I was licking sandpaper. I whimpered, "Jesus, Ian, I thought you were one of those things. Oh God, I'm so sorry." He didn't react to my apology. He just turned around and kept walking in the direction we were going in. Amy watched everything unfold numbly before she started following him. Oliver shook his head sadly. He didn't look any better. His eyes were glazed and his lips were cracked and red from rubbing them. I watched my brother shamble forward, and it reminded me of one of those old voodoo movies where someone is put into a trance and forced to work until they die from exhaustion. His mouth hung open and he moved like he was being dragged along like a string puppet. I picked up the walking stick and began to follow him. I wondered how much longer he had left in him, and what any of us would do if he fell over and stopped walking. I wondered how much longer any of us had. I don't know how long we walked. Everything melted together in a muddled malaise at the time. I remembered losing my footing and tripping a couple of times, but I barely felt it. The third time, I didn't even realize I was laying on the ground until Jessica stepped on me as she was passing by. There was no apology. She was too far gone to recognize that she had stepped on me. I dragged myself to my feet and felt lightheaded, but continued putting one foot in front of the other. The fifth time I fell, I wondered if it would be just better to lay down and wait to die. An excited yelp from behind me caused me to jump to my feet. It wasn't until I bumped into the sign for the Little Bear Canyon that I realized how close we were to salvation. The post for Little Bear Canyon also had a sign branching off that pointed in the direction of the JT Coral, which was only a few miles from where we started at the Gala Cliff Dwellings. Ian was heading in the right direction, and we were almost home free. In my excitement, I began calling out to the others to let them know that the end was near. I looked around me and shouted, "Jessica, Ian, Oliver, Heather, Amy! I know where we..." The words dropped on my lips as I counted the names and realized that it wasn't over yet. The others kept moving as if they didn't hear me talking. The impostor shuffled alongside us for once. It was easy to identify them. I don't know whether or not they let their guard down after seeing our conditions, but this one was obvious. She moved slowly, but her movements didn't convey exhaustion. Everyone else was sweating and looked like the Walking Dead, but she was fine. I waited for her to get close enough to follow the trail of where everyone was going down, before I raised Ethan's stick and growled, "Turn around right fucking now. I can see you." She turned around slowly and I felt my heart skip a beat. She looked almost exactly like Jessica, except for a brown tinge in her hair. She could have been her twin. I knew what it was planning before it even opened its mouth and asked, "What are you doing, Evan?" "Don't call me that," I winced. "What are you rambling about? Please move out of the way. We're almost safe from those things." "I know what you are." Heather turned white at the realization. She began speaking quickly. "I'm not one of those things, please, Evan. You have to remember. There were 6 of us. Those things want us to think that there were only 5 of us, and you can take one of us out without caring. Those things don't want us all. They only want the weakest ones. Please, let's go before they catch..." "Shut up," I snapped. I raised my walking stick in my hand and brandished it at her. "Think about it, Evan. Do I move like one of those things? Do I speak like them? There should be enough to prove that I'm human." "No. Ian's my brother. Jessica's his girlfriend. I'm your girlfriend. I sat on your lap on the car ride up here. Please, Evan, don't kill me. I love you. Don't you remember? Evan, I love you." I lowered my stick as it was in my hand as the memories bombarded me. I had met her one night when my brother forced me to go to the club with him. Heather had been sitting at the bar drinking all night. It wasn't until she tried to stand up and fell into my arms that we actually talked. I remember lazy Sundays in bed watching cheesy B sci-fi movies. I remember holding her close to me after making love, and hearing her whisper sweet nothings into my ear. I remembered our life together. I rasped, "Heather, I'm so sorry, I didn't know." She cooed. "Evan, it's not your fault." She went to touch me and I sprang back like I had been bitten by a snake. The instant I heard those words, I knocked. The stick caught her unaware on the side of the face. I felt her jaw give way under the sudden force of my attack. She gurgled through broken teeth, "I love..." The second strike dented her temple. As the temporal bone shattered, she kept trying to talk. But it was too late. Too much damage had been done. The door was shut to me now. I kept swinging the stick down on her head until it splintered and snapped. I looked up from her twitching body and saw my brother, watching me in horror. "Heather, oh my god." I spoke through gritted teeth and regarded him with red-rimmed eyes. "Come on, we have to go." He went to keep talking, but I walked past him. I didn't want to explain it to him. He eventually ran ahead, invigorated by the prospect of finding rescue on the road. I looked behind me one last time. The last thing I saw was one of those things dragging away Heather's corpse. It looked emaciated and half mad with starvation. At that very moment, I wasn't afraid of the thing. I just felt pity. Whether or not it forced the emotion on me, I'll never know. I turned away and caught up with the others on Route 15. We were on the road for 15 minutes before we managed to flag a car down and an ambulance was called for us. The doctor said that our exposure to the elements, combined with our starvation and dehydration, triggered the auditory and visual hallucinations that we experienced. It was the typical response you would expect after hearing the half-dead ramblings about creatures warping their flesh and our memories to drive us to the brink of death, also they could prey on us when we were at our weakest. We spent a week there while receiving treatments, recounting our horrific experiences, and the subsequent psych evaluations before we were released. I tried to talk to the others about it. Ian and Jessica refused to talk to me about it. I didn't really know Oliver or Amy, so that offer's off the table. They just want to forget. I can't. I can't forget. Now here's the thing. I can still remember Nadia asking me to help her find her lighter. I recall staying up late and talking with her by the campfire, all while she smoked like a chimney. I can recite Jerry's terrible puns that he'd make up about almost everything. And mostly Lucas's determination about hiking through the trail while he slowly succumbed to the effects of multiple sclerosis. I can recall whispering sweet nothing into Jessica's ear under the glow of the full moon. I can still envision that moment as clear as day. Even months later, I know the conversation we had word for word. I can still remember the feeling of her skin against mine, and the smell of her hair as I pressed myself up against it when we reached that one true moment of connectivity. I remember Heather pleading and begging me not to kill her. Despite writing this down months later, I can see all of these things clearly. Sometimes late at night, I can even remember driving up to Gala National Park, all with Heather sitting on my lap, playfully grinding against me, telling me how fun our hike was going to be. Sometimes I think about that memory, probably more than I should. Since I can't talk to Jessica or my brother about this, I had to find some other outlet. I guess I'm writing this all down for one reason: catharsis. In the end, I keep wondering if I did right, if I made the right choice. I want you to read this and tell me that I had no other option, that the risk of one of them escaping into the city forced my hand. I know it's not the case. I could have walked away or tried to scare her off. What kind of person can look into someone's eyes, remember all the things they did in the life they had, and then did what I did? Who can have all those memories and still end things so callously? It doesn't matter if none of it was real, because in the moment, it was to me. Who can look at someone and feel so much love for them before you kill them? The answer to that question is simple, now that I ask it out loud. I don't like the answer. Evan. Guys, thank you so much for watching. This one took me a little bit longer than normal to record, but I think it came out pretty well. I would like to thank any of the patrons listed on screen: Dan R., Cody V., Paul Z., Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A., and Dark Side of the Bear. Guys, thank you so much. You single-handedly keep this channel floating, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. If you want to join the Patreon down below, you get access to Patreon-only content and a bunch of other extra goodies. Go down to the Patreon link in the description if that's something that would interest you. Thank you for listening.